Hey folks, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for our series Coffee and Compliance, where we speak with security and compliance experts. Today we're going to be talking with CPA Andrew on managing SOC 2 audit exceptions. My name is Matt Cooper. I'm a senior manager for privacy, risk, and compliance at Vanta. I've been consulting in SOC 2 readiness for quite some time. Andrew, you want to give a brief introduction?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Andrew Gulrajani. I am a partner relations manager on the partner team here at Vanta. I joined Vanta about a year and a half ago, but was with Deloitte for a couple years prior. Was leading SOC 2 assessments for large enterprise public cloud companies. So nice to be talking with you all.
Okay, awesome. So, Andrew, since you are a subject matter expert, why don't you just lay out for us briefly, like what is a SOC 2 audit? What is it covering?
Definitely. So a SOC 2 engagement is an audit report that covers a company's product or service. As cloud companies, support customers, they need a way to demonstrate trust as customers interact with that service, really pertinent to like security controls. And so a SOC 2 report is over that product or service that is being used by that end user, and covers all things around, security, availability, confidentiality, as well as processing integrity and privacy. And so customers can scope a SOC 2 report around what they want that product or service to be, and then pull in relevant controls around those specific areas.
Okay, good. So one thing we get asked a lot is like, hey, can I fail my SOC 2 report? So I was hoping you could lay out for us, what are some of the things that can go wrong and, how does that look in a SOC 2?
Definitely. So, in terms of a SOC 2 audit itself, everyone strives to have what's called an unqualified opinion. So, the SOC 2 report, it has a list of trust service criteria. If you get an unqualified opinion, that means that all of those specific criteria have been achieved, and therefore, risks have been mitigated as part of what the AICP has put out. In terms of what could go wrong, with those specific controls, an auditor would evaluate whether that control has, no exceptions. They could also determine and find if a control did not operate properly and a control has failed, and render, what's called an audit exception. And we're going to dive kind of deeper into, what that really means and like why it's important. Uh, that's, having exceptions in a report does not mean that you automatically fail a SOC 2 report. It's actually very common to have exceptions. We see the kind of failure within SOC 2 around what's called a qualified opinion. And so if an audit exception becomes, material and there's a risk that has not been mitigated, an auditor could point to that specific issue and say that, this risk that exists, there's no controls to mitigate it, has actually caused that criteria to not be achieved. And so they would qualify their opinion. And that basically says, again, that there's some kind of material risk that exists within a company's environment. There's also something that's called an adverse SOC 2 opinion. This is like very, very rare. I've never actually seen it come into play. But that effectively means that something is so big and so risky, there's no controls to mitigate it, but the customer actually does not agree that that risk is present within the company's environment.
Okay. Okay, good. So there's exceptions. There's obviously things that can be worse than that. Break down for us what exactly is an exception?
Yeah. So an exception would be an instance where a control did not operate properly. And so, as part of a SOC 2 and broadly an audit engagement, auditors look to see that a control is properly designed, it's been implemented in an environment, and that it operates effectively. And so, for those three components, they would look to see, what is that process that you follow? So, to like give an example, a company does background checks on users as they join an organization. The company probably has a process to where, a new hire joins, they would run that background check screening, that's great. Implementation of a control would be like, hey, show us like one instance of that person getting a background screen. So, I am a new hire, I join an organization, I see that the company ran a background check. For an auditor, that's assurance that that control has been properly implemented. The operating effective component takes that to kind of, a different level. They would actually look to see that like for a specific set of new hires over a period of time, which is your audit window, have you run background checks on those individuals throughout that specific period. During that audit window, if there's an instance where a customer, forgot to run a background check or, for some reason like didn't happen, that would be an exception to the control, right? Because a customer has said to the auditor that like, hey, we run background checks on all new hires. If one new hire didn't get a background check for some specific reason, and there are justifications and like ways to not have them be part of the control. But if that person should have gotten a background check and they didn't, that would be an audit exception. And so the auditor would ask questions in terms of what does that mean? Why didn't they get a screen? And if there isn't, sufficient answers, that can lead to an audit exception for your SOC 2.
Okay, perfect. So that's a good, clear example background check. But if I have, 1,000 people and maybe one person didn't get a background check, it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal potentially. It depends on who they are, but can you talk about, how exceptions affect the customer? Are they all the same or are there differences depending on what the exception is?
There's definitely differences in how this works in practice. So, in that example, if like one person didn't get a background check out of the thousands of people a customer hires, like that's not necessarily as big of a risk, right? And so like there's, it's a manual process most likely, things happen, maybe it just got dropped, it's probably going to be okay. There are differences in terms of what kind of exception that could be. So like depending on, what area the exception occurs in and like what the nature of that risk is, that really determines like kind of how severe an audit exception for a SOC 2 could be. So like, in that same example, one person to get a background check, it's probably not going to be the end of the world. But like, let's say a person had, admin access to your AWS environment and they either should not have, or like that access is totally inappropriate. That person theoretically could actually cause real harm and real damage to, the overall company as well as your downstream customers. And so something like that should be taken more seriously in terms of thinking through how we would approach that area going forward.
Okay, perfect. Hey, there's one more thing I didn't ask about that I've heard of in reports sometimes referred to as an opportunity for improvement or an OFI. Is that the same as an exception? Where does that fit in?
Yeah, so we've seen OFIs occur throughout engagements. This opportunity for improvement. This is something that the auditor might bring to the company's attention as a potentially risky area, and kind of how the name suggests, like an opportunity for improvement. And so maybe that's adding a step in the workflow, or maybe that's altering it in a slight way to better manage that risk. This is really kind of the consulting nature of some of these auditors as well. That wouldn't necessarily translate to a specific audit exception. It's kind of something for the company to take back, internalize, think through, and then adapt workflows kind of based on that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so if you are going to get an exception you might be getting one, how does that come up in the audit process? Is the auditor just going to say, hey, Andrew, we found an exception, or, what's sort of the flow that companies should pay attention to?
Yeah, certainly. So, tactfully, what an auditor wants to do is not call an audit exception until they're very certain that it is going to be an issue. And so really for this area, an auditor is going to probe and ask questions to determine what's the extent of this, weird thing that's either missing or something looks kind of off. They're going to probe around that specific area to see if they can gather more information on, potentially why this specific example, if it's a sample based thing, didn't follow the control, right? So they don't want to come out just out of the gates and say that's an audit exception, that's a problem, fix it. They're going to be very cautious here. I mean, accountants are, kind of conservative in nature. And so just they want to approach these areas carefully because they want to, figure out what's the extent, how does this, how do we approach it going forward? So they may probe questions or bring the specific example to you and say, hey, for this specific code commit that you made, it looks like it's missing a ticket or it looks like it's missing some component. Are we understanding this correctly that this should have, testing included or should have that documentation? So they'll probe, they'll ask questions. What you should take away from that as a customer is this could be an area of interest to them. And so what I would do is I would turn around and, ask, either the team or if own the area, try to go gather additional information that can supplement why that thing either followed the control or what might be missing in terms of the auditor's understanding. that back and forth, I would say be very tactful and conscientious of the communication back to the auditor, because like information that you give them as part of this process, they are going to internalize and think through, like, is there a risk here, right? And like, based on their understanding, they think that they should have something around this area and they're missing that information. So, there is that back and forth, but ultimately they're not just going to come flat out of the gates like this is a problem, right?
Okay, good. That's really helpful. So it sounds like then when the auditor raises a potential exception or something that's strange in their testing, you might actually have an opportunity where you can provide more context and it will eventually not end up being an exception on the report. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, certainly. So the way I would think about this is, controls are designed to mitigate risk, right? And so anything that a customer could provide in terms of like why this thing either was not risky or, followed the process, but in kind of a unique way. Those are ways to like circumnavigate and like handle these exceptions or potential issues as they arise. And so really it's like trying to think through like, is there a risk with this specific situation? And to pile onto that, like, is there supplementary information I can provide that auditor to show that there's actually nothing risky about this situation?
Okay, great. All right, let's say that we have an exception, like, the background check. We just didn't do one. We have no way to explain that. And so, we accept that. Does the company then have some opportunity to respond to that exception or, give their side of the story, some sort of explanation, something like that?
Yeah. So once the exception has been confirmed, and typically this is, presented by the auditor and accepted by the customer, right? Like, we didn't do the background check, right? If you just land at that part, like, kind of black and white. So what happens next, in section 4 of the SOC 2, that contains like, all the controls, all the criteria, and all just like the testing steps associated with, the control, as well as that conclusion on testing. And so, for 99% of the controls, it's going to say like no exception noted. Once there's an agreement in terms of like this is an audit issue and going to go in the report, they would flip that to say exception noted. They would do a little write up that says like 1 out of 25 people we looked at didn't have a background check. From there, the customer has the opportunity to respond. It's called management's response because like the auditor is projecting something about a company's security controls. It's totally equitable and fair for the customer to respond and like say, we acknowledge this exception, and this is kind of how we internalize it, thought through it, and how we plan on like mitigating this going forward. And so you can add this into a SOC 2 report in a couple different places. Section 4 is going to have the exception language as well as like management's response. You can put it right in there. Include language around how we're going to treat this going forward. Section 5 of a SOC 2 report is like other information. It's non-audited, but an opportunity for a customer to add in really kind of anything they want around their security posture, their program, how we're thinking about compliance. That's another very common spot to put it as well. So, either place works in terms of like where you'd want to include that response. But I do highly, highly recommend, if there is an audit issue, including something around, how we're responding, how we're thinking about this, because that just tells your customers that, one, you're taking this seriously and just communicating to them that like we're going to do things in the future to mitigate this from happening.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's get into what I think everyone wants to really take away from this, which is how do we avoid exceptions in the first place? Do you have any advice for us there?
Yeah. So exceptions are, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but they are common in reports, mainly because, there's an overall like compliance program manager, but you are reliant on other people to, own and operate some of these security controls. A lot of them are also like manual processes, right? And so like, responsibility gets like delineated throughout the organization in terms of like HR owns the background check controls. Our engineering folks own, the access controls, right? So you're relying on a lot of people to help, overall manage a security program and compliance kind of out of that. So, ensuring that everyone in the org that has, a stake in this report and in this project, making sure they're aware of their security controls and responsibilities is probably the biggest thing. I would, make it well known at the start of these projects that our SOC 2 is coming up. This is our window. Here are your expectations, making sure people are familiar with like what they need to do. And more importantly, like when, especially if they're manual controls. Tooling or processes can help with this area. So like, a GRC platform, some mechanism to have, your controls listed centrally. People can access them, view them. You can tag people in certain things when you need them to do something or upload evidence. And the other just like kind of key component of this, which I just kind of talked through, but just like introducing automation and security controls where possible. That's going to lead to, a lot less exceptions over time, mainly because, you're not then relying on humans to go do activities, right? So like, this is where tools like Vanta can certainly help. I think of our GitHub and change management tests around, our repositories. We can test for things around like requiring approval for these repositories. So, with confidence as a customer, that like any code change that's impacting, production and downstream customers is going to go through some sort of code review process. Those sorts of little automation and things that we, monitoring your environment will just go a long way in terms of like kind of ease of mind in terms of like managing and minimizing the exceptions over time.
Okay, that's super helpful. So my takeaway there is, hey, you need to check your controls, and then ideally you have strong processes and automation so that they have to follow a defined path, and then that's going to prevent you from having exceptions in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. I think like the biggest thing is just like trying to move away from, manual processes where you're reliant on other humans to do things and moving to more of an automated monitoring environment. That's just going to, take responsibility out of people and put it with technology where, in terms of like going through one of these engagements, it just gives you more confidence in terms of like, I, have a grasp on these security controls in a more kind of, centralized way.
Perfect. Andrew, thank you so much for your insights today. Hopefully, folks appreciated this and you have a little bit of knowledge about how to manage exceptions and avoid them in the first place. So, Andrew, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt. Appreciate it.
Cheers.